Thanks so much, John, and a huge welcome to everyone on the call. And I'll just echo again, and a special thank you to our colleagues in inhospitable time zones who are joining us too. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tarek Kokar. I'm the head of data for science and health at the Wellcome Trust, who's one of the funders, part of the evidence synthesis infrastructure collaborative. We're convening this call actually on behalf of the funders' interest group, so all the funders who've expressed interest and support for ESIC, and it's really to make progress on what we see as a critical foundational enabler of ESIC, which is this open data system. And briefly, just to say, we see the open data system as a key investment that all other capabilities in ESIC build on. And in fact, communities across ESIC can participate in the development and creation of. So that's why we're convening this series of calls. I'm conscious we have a pretty big group, and doing this sort of work in a big group is harder. But I think in the spirit that we've developed ESIC so far, I think we can go further together. So this is the first of three calls where we're really hoping to establish collectively a sense of where we are. And then over the series of the next three calls, we can figure out a clear idea of where we want to be and how we might get there. We're tight on time, so I won't go any further than that. Just a huge thank you for your time and commitment to this and the next couple of calls. Looking forward to the discussion, and I'll hand back to John to walk us through the agenda. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, Tarek. In the calendar entry, you'll see three files. All of them were sent to you beforehand, but one of them is an updated version, and we're going to take them as read. So there are two slides about the background to ESIC, and if ESIC is new to you, there's a hyperlink to the website. There's also a two-page handout about the open data system to frame the conversation. And the third file is the Excel spreadsheet with all of the people who've been invited to the meeting. And our apologies that the initial communication wasn't clear about the idea that for any organization or initiative, we are hoping for one individual from the Global South and either one or up to two individuals, from the Global North, and up to one or at most two individuals from the Global South. So we're really trying to get active participation and leadership in this space from the Global South, hence the larger number of invitees, often from an organization or an initiative from the Global South. The only other thing is that if you have comments that are more about updating us about initiatives, we'll happily capture those through the chat box. But please put up your hand if you want to make a comment that may shape the rest of the conversation. So if it's more factual updating, we're not sure if you know about this initiative, please use the chat box. If it's about steering for the conversation, please consider putting up your hand. We have three presentations that we're going to cycle through quickly. One of them is going to be a recording simply because of poor internet connections where our colleagues are located. So the first presentation is a live one. It comes from James Thomas on behalf of a group who's doing an extraordinary job of advancing work on the open data system. So without further ado, James, could I turn it over to you? And we can see your slides.
There we go. Thank you. I hope you can hear me now. The team has helpfully hit the unmute button as soon as I shared the screen. Yeah, well, thank you for the invitation to come and talk to you. The brief is to talk about where we are currently with existing investments. And I think I should have capitalized the we there, because there are a number of projects and a lot of people involved that have been shaping this. So whilst I'm talking to it, there's an awful lot of people that have input into this, not just now, but over the many years. With my slightly geeky Anunnaki hat on, this is almost like a dream come true, in that this is something that a number of us have been sort of dreaming of for a long time. So it's quite exciting to see it starting to take shape. So just a quick slide to orientate what we've been working on before I get into the details of it. It's quite in line with the ESIC roadmap, as we've got a little picture there, and really the sort of like the core objective of what we're building here is a platform which can enable anyone to discover, use, and add to diverse evidence from around the world. And I think one of the critical things about this is really like the last bullet point here, which is that it's very much focused on data for evidence synthesis. It's not trying to set up a new platform for science. This is around evidence for decision making, and it's not duplicating existing evidence synthesis platforms and things. It's to support those kinds of work. It's kind of like the back end to sort of like feed that living data through to through to lots of decision-making contexts. So the idea being that it's connected, it's living data, and it will deliver synthesis-ready data to people who need to carry out evidence synthesis for decision-making. Very importantly within this program, especially empowering those traditionally excluded from power, and also being driven by and accountable to diverse evidence users. So a lot of time people say, well, what's in the repository? And we can say what's there now, but a lot of the content will be driven by the people who are using the system. The other point, of course, is around harnessing the capability of AI, but also being mindful of its limitations and the uncertainty, and being able to make sure that when we're using AI content, that we're able to sort of surface uncertainties to users. So at a high level, we've basically got a repository in the middle. On the top left, we've got where the data come from into the repository. On the bottom left, we've got the enhancements, which I'll talk through with that data, and then we've got the use of the data. And so the repository itself, whilst I'm talking about a repository, it's actually being built up of multiple repositories. So it's just like a container for lots of repositories. So we're starting with the Destiny project, and I'm assuming I'm not supposed to introduce all the projects, otherwise that'll take all my 10 minutes. There's Destiny, which is in climate and health, and its sister project, Solace AI, also climate and health, from Wellcome. Jacobs, which is funding a program of evidence synthesis work and taxonomy work in education. Genos, which is in mental health, LEAD, which is dementia, a Wellcome funded project, and then the forthcoming ESRC funded METIUS project, which has got these sectoral hubs in crime and justice, education, sustainable development, and environment and society. And so the idea being really that this whilst it's being sort of built within a number of projects, is extensible so that we can add more projects to it as we go through. For the purposes of these slides, though, I'm going to just call it this, because otherwise it gets too complicated. So in terms of where we're getting data from for this repository, there's like the fairly traditional sources as you might expect for evidence synthesis systems: bibliographic databases, trials registries, etc. And what we've already got in there at the moment is we're taking OpenAlex. We've got a living feed every day of records from OpenAlex, and the contributions from different communities have already started, obviously with Destiny in climate and health, and we're just gearing up with Jacobs, Galenos, and then obviously those other projects coming through as we go. In terms of the enhancements, which are really sort of like the key to turning bibliographic data and files into actually usable evidence. We've got on the right hand side here, we've got some sort of robots which I've wanted to be in place for years, and we're finally getting these in place now. So where we've got records which have no abstracts against them, either because they're not written or because publishers have hidden them, we've got a service there which, if it's a record we're interested in, goes and finds the abstract. Fairly mundane, but really critical for actually then understanding what a piece of research is about. Likewise, getting the full text for stuff which we're actually genuinely interested in, and being able to tell whether or not the records are the same, a deduplication system, but also what we're also building in there is a system which will sort of identify where you've got multiple records from the same trial, so studification essentially, and mapping against clinical trials databases. So those are sort of robots which we really have needed in place for a long time, and so I'm really glad that we've now got those deployed. And then we've got the enhancements which take the data as you might expect to find in a journal article, and then we've got taxonomies and vocabularies. So these could be, for example, a risk of bias tool or a data extraction tool, or simply a tool which says, is this relevant for this review or this map or this database or not? So lots of different ways in which a record might be classified or information extracted from it. And then we've then got AI-enabled human-in-the-loop processes which take the data as reported and the classification framework schema or the risk of bias, whatever we're doing. And then depending on how accurate the AI is and how available humans are, we want to be able to turn the sort of like the messy textual data into structured data, enhanced data, which can then be stored in the repository and then also used for subsequent iterations around this pipeline of human and machine-enabled enhancement processes. So a quick example from the Destiny example. Destiny project. We're starting on the right here, on the left, sorry, with one, which is the DOI, so just the reference to the fact that the paper is existing somewhere. We can then use the API to go and get the bibliographic metadata around that. We can then go and use the get the abstract enhancement to get the abstract. We can also get the full text enhancement, and then we can then go into the next phase of enhancements, which is a sort of more about interpretation and the translation of that evidence for a particular use case, which is, in our case, is Destiny, which is climate and health, assessing whether or not a particular record is relevant for climate and health, and also then classifying if it is according to a large taxonomy that we've been developing there. Then finally, on the stage here, we've then got the robot which is just being worked on at the moment, which is around the transferability model that Miaka and Debase have been working on. So there, we've got a particular record in the data set, and what we're interested in there is assessing its relevance for a particular decision-making context. So we start with sort of fairly mundane, getting more metadata about an object, and then we increasingly get more refined and more sort of context-specific information about that particular record. So in terms of how these are then used, we've got open APIs, we've got search, discovery interface, mapping interfaces, and connections to evidence synthesis tools. So these are the one red, what we've now published. What we've yet to do is set up the system as a data provider for other people then to build models from, or to bulk export data for subsequent downstream processing. But there's quite a lot of that that's now built there. And then just as a quick example for you, we've got the Destiny dashboard, which is looking at this repository. So we've processed so far 3.5 million records this year. We can see it's gone up by 209,000 the last time we ran an update. Nearly 14 million enhancements. So those are classifications using those robots on the left of the picture that I showed you. Last updated yesterday. We've got this taxonomy that I mentioned, which we're classifying all the records using, and then we've got a sort of like a yearly distribution there, which we can see. And this is a pilot user interface which we're using to test different patterns for mapping from users, so people can say, I'm interested in this way, or I'm interested in being able to sort of create an evidence and gap map, or I want to search the database and download records in a particular way. So I think I've probably rattled through that quite quickly, but I hope that's given you a sense of what we've building and what is already in place. It's all open source. The documentation is available there on those links. There's a software development kit, which we're increasingly adding to. The deduplication is going into there at the moment. And there's, importantly, there are several groups already working collaboratively across this, and it's designed so that those enhancements, the AI-enabled enhancements, can be developed independently, and they can be deployed independently of the sort of like the main repository environment, and that's sort of supported by design, so it can be a very distributed system. There's an awful lot to do still, but we're very excited about where it's going, and also about the progress we've made so far. So thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, James. And in our next call, you're going to have a chance to talk a little bit about where you hope to be by when with further developments. Is it safe to assume that some of the other things in the table in the 2-page briefing note, like metadata around context and equity groups, connecting into question banks, connecting into protocol registration to facilitate active management, connecting into data sets that include things like ROB assessments, grade assessments, and so on. All of that is stuff that you'll be able to talk about next time as potential future?
No, exactly. I was sticking very strictly to my, this is what's there now, and not sort of talking about what's coming. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So let's open it up for quick questions. And again, if it's about factual connections to amazing work underway, like Brian Alper has put in the chat box, please continue to add that. But if there are big strategic questions about where we are with this open data system, now would be the time to ask them. In a few minutes, we'll then move on to hearing from a couple of colleagues from the Global South. So any questions or comments for James? Anamiki?
Yes, thank you. Maybe it's a stupid question, but I wasn't sure, is it data from literature you are collecting, or is it the raw data repository, or publications?
Yeah, sure. It's possibly both. Certainly data from literature, but also data from evidence synthesis, systematic review tools too. So there is bibliographic data coming into the living repository, so that we're always getting the bibliographic data coming through, and then the data which are particularly useful for decision making, then they're going through evidence synthesis tools, and they're going through sort of like these humans and AI systems to then decide which classifications they might have. And so at that point it's data. There's also a question about connecting some of this to sort of we've got one of the sort of like the data sources is local data or other types of data, so that we can then look at contextualizing the data that's coming from sort of one context for use in another. And so that's part of what the transferability model is about too. So it is for it is not trying to cover the whole of science, though. This is still just evidence for decision making. I think that's one of the key things. Otherwise we end up trying to cover everything, and so we do need to focus it just on the data that will be needed for decisions.
Excellent, thanks. So there's a long lineup, so let's do some quick snappers. Alaka, and then we'll move on to Peter, and then maybe come back to James to respond to both. Alaka.
Hi, thank you. This is Alaka from the World Bank. We and I think a number of other people that I see on the call are working on kind of building a similar platform at the World Bank. So I'm particularly interested, and we'll connect with you on kind of some of the things you presented, because we're facing the same issues of integrating some of the things that you called robots. We're kind of working on that live, so it'd be great to connect. But my main question is on kind of your previous answer, which is the data for decision making. That's like kind of very much tied into the use case of this repository, and so can you elaborate kind of, even though it may not have, I know you're still in pilot phase, what are the exact use cases and what are the decisions that you think this platform will serve?
And maybe James, just hold on one sec. Let's take a question from Peter as well. Peter Bragg.
Hi, James. Nice to see you.
Yeah.
It actually dovetails pretty well with Alaka's question. I was wondering the extent to which end user driven questions shape the data taxonomies or the fields, or whether the data taxonomies and fields are fixed and you're trying to find the best fit with the real world questions.
James?
Yeah, those are great questions. Okay, so in terms of the taxonomies and the fit between them and the real world questions, I think that is absolutely at the heart of what the point of this exercise is really. We can take, I don't know, the ISD terms, for example. We can take mesh terms, which are sort of like these general vocabularies. But I do tend to, I've spent an awful lot of my life sitting around tables talking about taxonomies and terms. And, unless they're rooted in the context of use, they are really, really difficult to, know what to do with in a project like this. So the point is that it will support multiple sort of views and perspectives on potentially the same piece of evidence, because that evidence then needs contextualizing. And so, as a piece of evidence is used in different contexts, then potentially someone then can look at the different ways it's been viewed. It's not to say that, a study didn't happen here and these weren't the results of it, but actually then the way that it's interpreted for use may well have different pieces of metadata attached to it. So that, I hope that answers what you're talking about there, but I think that's very, very important. And it speaks a little bit to the other question, which was around the types of decisions. And I think that we could spend a long time thinking about different types of decision making, but I think broadly, you can see a system like this being used to answer fairly narrow questions, like potentially might expect with Cochrane reviews. You might do a meta-analysis of the results of this, but also, and one of the challenges that we've got in the Metius project is thinking more broadly and more ambitiously about what a policy scale review and evidence synthesis looks like. And that's answering really quite big questions which cut across multiple disciplines and contexts. And there, what I'm hoping is that we can see the AI enable us to scale up the breadth of questions and potentially then the scale of the answers that we can provide. Always, I think, always really being mindful that we need to think about being able to scale the utility of an answer to the level that someone's asking the question at. It's no good sort of giving an answer which requires them to respond at a global level if actually they've got a very local decision-making context and they can't affect global politics. So I think that we've got to get that balance right, which is part of the interpretation of the evidence.
Great, thanks, James. We'll quickly go to Gabrielle Ariana, and then we'll go to Chris, and I see a question from Lara, and then we're gonna have to move on to hear from our colleagues in the Global South. We've tried really hard to get all of the groups around the globe that are working in this space. And as James so clearly articulated, the intent is not to try to control those, but to say, can we work in a more collective impact orientation, and are there ways that we can leverage one another's work? Gabrielle, could we go to you?
Yeah, thanks, John. Well, my question is in part related with that, and it's in a strategic question. I'm Gabriel Rada. I'm the director of Epistemonicos Foundation. We are a group based in Chile that is, I understand, part of the Global South. And we have already developed something that has all the functionalities that you have described, James, in terms of the living repository with all the AI enablers. We have developed a taxonomy that is quite comprehensive. And many of these things are already in use by WHO, PAHO, and other organizations. And my question was related with what is the process to be part of this conversation, because we have never been contacted in relation with this initial stage.
Ariana, we'll go to you. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Good morning, everyone. I had a question regarding, you said it's a depository. And so what I understand from that is that you're not actually curating those depositories, but you're getting a feed into your depository. Is that correct? And if so, what is the process through which those depositories are updated? And is there any way that different depositories could be differentially efficient in doing what they're doing? So you're starting maybe from the best depositories, and then as you grow, what would be, and understanding you have process to manage the duplicates, that's great. But what is the process through which you ensure quality across the system, or whether you are providing kind of some thinking and some ways of others to contribute? Second, on this whole question of open access versus not, how are we managing those issues? Thank you.
James, very briefly, and I can come in on Gabrielle's question if there are things you don't cover. Did you want to respond quickly to both?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so copyright and that kind of thing. We're obviously staying the right side of the law with all of this stuff, but we are also aware that we have the right to process text and other copyrighted material and make our metadata available for public good. And so that's certainly what we're planning to do. The ingestion and the updating is and the accuracy is a really important part of the pipeline. I think for a start, it's really important to say that this is almost like a container which will bring in material for different projects to utilize. And it's not for a small group to be able to sort of determine quality assurance thresholds or standards or processes for everybody. But what is important to do is to sort of create systems which expose the relative confidence and accuracy of particular processes. So what what we're trying to do with the Destiny repository, for example, is to create workflows which will automate the discovery of data into the map of the field, for example, but will also tell people how accurate those processes are, and will probably be over inclusive so that there will be some noise in there, but at least we will have the records that we're looking for. Likewise, for the subsequent systems, what we want to be able to do is to basically evaluate everything as we go, and then to be able to say, okay, so this is as accurate as X and Y is, and also to consult with people to say, is this accurate enough for your your use case? If it's not, then we have to go back. But also that's partly what the human in the loop part is about. So it's to be able to identify where we can rely on AI, let's call it AI, and where we need to have humans involved in terms of the nuance and interpretation that they can bring. So I don't think it's not possible to say exactly how every single part of it will, how accurate it will be. It's partly a matter of how accurate it needs to be, but then also it's a matter of how much resource we have available to perform particular tasks. And yeah, Gabriel's point about the how to get involved, I think that's partly what this process is for, isn't it? I think the one thing about this is that it's a project which we've had an ambition to work on for a long time, but also this is obviously across the whole of sort of social science and other areas as well as health. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Great. And I'll just say, Gabriel, this is the first call. So the reason why we've gathered all of you is to try to level set about where we are. To James' point, the aspiration here is an open data system that serves all sectors, health being one of anticipated 14 sectors that would be the focus of this work. And we specifically asked James to come in because he has funding through a lot of these other sectoral areas of focus to work on this open data system with other partners like Jan, Julian, and others. But this is an open tent, hence the first of 3 calls. And we're going to come to ways in for funding to colleagues in the Global South. James, maybe you could answer Laura's question in the chat box after. It's about whether guidelines are included. We'll just take a final question from Chris now and then move on. Chris?
Hi, thanks, James. Thanks for the presentation. I'm Chris Trisos. I'm Director of Ascend, a Climate and Development Synthesis Center based at University of Cape Town, South Africa. James, I had a question in looking across the whole repository plus extensions that you presented, in the focus of it being on decision making. In what ways are you imagining decision makers perhaps ever engaging with this directly, or is there always a strong research intermediary? And how much of that kind of, in our experience, a lot of the in-person or facilitated co-design to even get to the policy question that then you can ask in the evidence synthesis process is a key piece of infrastructure, so to speak, that's often missing in the African context. And so is this doing that, or is that still something separate that's needed in the chain from what you're building to someone actually making a decision?
Yeah, that's a lovely question, and it's there isn't agreement across the field in terms of exactly who should be interacting with research evidence to make decisions, and who, I don't know if people say who shouldn't, but the point of this system is to get the evidence in a format and a place and a sort of a currency which it can then be used. One of the questions we've got at the moment, the very live question in other projects, is whether we're sort of wanting this to be used to develop, one of these, I don't know, decision maker chatbots where they can ask a question, it goes away and comes up with the evidence, and how comfortable we are with that kind of tool, as opposed to something where we're saying, no, this is designed for an intermediary or a knowledge broker or somebody, and they do the analysis and then they take the data and the answer, the evidence to the decision maker. And I think that's probably not for us to decide. I think it's the repository is the repository, or the repository is for the data, and the way in which those data are utilized will then be up to other sort of downstream users and uses.
And I'll just add that, keep in mind, as you'll have seen in the slide deck, this is one of 5 foundational investments. So another will be in the regional hubs that will bring together the evidence intermediaries that are going to be feeding the demand side questions in, and in turn contextualizing the data as questions emerge in national and local processes. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the pre-recorded video. We have one of the 2 presenters on the line, Lawrence. This group was asked to give us a summary of where we are with existing Global South leadership in the tech space and what we've learned about how to and how not to foster such leadership. The anticipated investment is meant to be primarily in the Global South. So this conversation, is hopefully setting the stage for that. So I'm going to share my screen. I just tried to, but I managed to do it without sound. So just give me 1 second.
So Lawrence and I would like to say, a few things about where we are, with Global South leadership, especially in the tech space. What we've learned, we've been at this for a while, and we've gotten some lessons on how to do things, but also how not to do certain things, in terms of fostering such leadership. And, maybe if we take it back to the start, like, why are we even speaking to this? If you have followed the conversations, the general architecture of the conversations around this, all the way from the co-convening of the Cape Town Consensus and its call for equity, as is currently then, but also is currently captured, in the consensus statement. If you look at, our revisions of the roadmap and especially the standalone equity companion, and then, the statement, that was made at the UN General Assembly, and most recently, if you were in Benin at Evidence 2025, whether you were there or you were following the conversations online and in any other spaces, and watched that ESIC Africa panel that we had, you'll see that all of this actually aligns. The conversation is coming together. And it's been said, we've had it loud and clear, at ESIC, that there is consensus for Global South leadership across ESIC solutions, including the tech space. We've had this from, practitioners, funders, technologists, policymakers, citizens. Think about any space, any group, people are speaking to the same thing. And some of these calls are already kind of backed up by tangible actions. People are walking the talk. For example, the South African, government is now developing an ESIC roadmap, the South African ESIC roadmap. And politically, they actually co-sponsored the UN General Assembly launch, if you remember that. But also another very good example is look at how the ESIC investments, the current existing investments are quite aligned, upping their spend, some of them maxing out, and towards leadership in the Global South. A very other good example is just these 3 calls, if you look at them, they are really speaking to the same thing. So what we think is that we have consensus on building this leadership and shifting resources. And this is a fantastic opportunity. It is a milestone for our community, but I want to emphasize how much it is a fantastic opportunity for us to actually take up. And I think, Lawrence, you'd agree with me and maybe, enlighten us some more on some of this.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rona. And I couldn't agree more about how amazing this opportunity is. And we're certainly not shifting resources and power into a vacuum. It builds on decades of investment and innovation in the Global South around tech leadership and tech development. We'd be here the whole day if I'd had to list every single tool and system that has been built. But maybe some quick sound bites. Right now in the Lake Chad region, eBay is having a transferability toolkit that looks into data sharing and AI integration across different policy contexts. The largest and most used evidence mapping software, the EpiMapper, maintained by colleagues at the Epicenter at UCL, is actually a piece of technology developed in South Africa that then, with the help of the colleagues at EPI has found its way around the world. So lots and lots of examples of practical use cases, policy impact stories around how different tools have been developed. And likewise, there's equal leadership around aggregating these tools up to portfolios of applications and systems of applications. I think, Rona, your team at ACRIS really has puts the bar up really high in that specific context. The golden thread that comes in the how has this leadership been built? I think it's a couple of principles, and particularly the principle of co-production and collaboration, principle of sharing IP, a principle of sharing data. So that is how we've built these applications, these tools, not in isolation, but together across different partners. And it's a bit in the DNA of our ecosystem, this open resource sharing and collaboration. And oftentimes it has been directly encouraged and incentivized by our policymakers. And that has led to that most of the tools developed are actually not targeting researchers, but they're targeting end users like policymakers or evidence brokers as an in-between. And I think that's slightly different to tools we see elsewhere. So I think the key message here really is that there is proven ability and leadership in the space, in the tech space in the Global South. However, there certainly is a few gaps left. And I think that's particularly around gaps in power and gaps in resourcing. On the resourcing side, most of the tools mentioned are individually, externally donor-funded projects. And even the portfolios of work that we have are essentially different partners using different individually donor-funded projects to kind of piggyback on it and bring it all together. And you can imagine for sustainability, that is really, really tricky, a way of resourcing it. There's two options that we see in the Global South often that we don't see often in the, that we see in the Global North often that we don't see as much here at home. The first one is being able to charge for a library of resources, charging users that and having that as a secure resource flow. And the second one is having subscription payments on a monthly or annual basis to the tools and applications that we have developed. Again, those lead to resource flows that are much more predictable than individually donor-funded projects, and we see much less of them in the Global South. In terms of power, we do know that many of the models are still developed elsewhere. That is changing slowly, but still the big models, particularly in the AI space, are not based in our regions. And the same goes for the big international databases of evidence that tend not to be based in our region. So where does this gap leave us? It definitely doesn't leave us in a situation where it's Global South or Global North. We have seen that this ecosystem has developed through collaboration and we're stronger through collaboration. That's our core value. It's probably around changing the power and how to collaborate a little bit and having an equal playing field in terms of agency and choice. So currently, Global South partners tend not to have the agency to choose who to work with in what context. The default option is an investment in the Global North, who then finds partners in the Global South. And that has worked well enough. But in a truly equal playing field, what I think the ESIC vision is, Global South partners would have the equal opportunity to lead on a collaboration with funds seeded in the Global South and finding the right partners for the specific opportunity, which in all likelihood will involve lots of Global North partners. But this type of collaboration would enrich us, where we'd have Global North partners and Global South partners, each being able to start collaborations and partnerships on their terms. And that likely will lead to more collaboration, not less, because suddenly we've developed completely new models of collaboration. So that's just a very quick where we're at. Very happy to dive deeper in the Q&A, and thanks again for listening to us.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I know Lawrence is on the line. Rona, because of a family issue, had to step away. Any brief questions or comments about that framing? Again, keep in mind that the aspiration here is to significantly involve the Global South in leading the ongoing evolution of this open data system. We're going to come back to that in calls 2 and 3, but any reactions to what we've heard about where we are and the lessons learned in fostering that kind of Global South leadership? Oh, sorry, I can see now questions or comments coming in the chat box. James, over to you.
So I know I've already spoken a fair bit. So just one of the concerns that I've got around the repository work is about, well, we've got quite Global North biased large databases at the moment, and we're very, very good at finding the records there, and we're getting increasingly good at it. And I suppose the worry that I've got is that we're now saying, okay, so we need more global south data, and it's almost as though, okay, so now we're going to sort of come and sort of suck in all of those repositories as well. And it's not easy. And that's one of the reasons we have commercial databases in the first place. There's actually quite a lot of work that goes in to curating a data set, and I can see some in the comments there. So which is what sparked that thought for me as well, which is that we need a model which doesn't just sort of say, okay, great, so we're now just going to, all of the carefully curated data which you've spent years putting together, we'll just make available for free, with which potentially then undermines the whole model where it was put together in the first place. So that's just a sort of concern to have at the moment. I don't know how we solve it.
Absolutely. And we do hope to open up the question about the business model in the next call. Carla's going to speak to it in a few minutes as well. And then that will also be likely a significant focus in our third call. Can I ask the person, I can't tell the first name, Anne Gembedes, would you be willing to jump in?
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the floor. I'm coming from EBase Africa, global south. So I want to share our own experience in this data space. And at EBase Africa, we have developed a transfer model where we use to transfer evidence across the context using a mathematical model. And with this our transfer model, we have been able to transfer evidence, and we have further developed it with the AI, integrated AI in the Destiny project. I'm happy I heard one of my colleagues talk about the Destiny project. With this transfer model, we have been able to integrate AI into Destiny project, and this has facilitated data sharing and reducing the research that is being not being well used. And in fact, this model is very, 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 very productive. At eBase Africa, we have also used storytelling through 3D, where we use evidence to get to policy practice, and people actually use it. In fact, in Africa and even Cameroon at eBase, we have continued this 3D to bypass all the main barriers that have access to evidence. And so we break language barrier. We break all the bottlenecks to ensure that evidence reaches the population. And we work together with Campbell, Cochrane, JBI, using our reviews, and we use to read the framework. And we are currently working with JBI funding across Cameroon, Kenya, Brazil, and Thailand, using this our 3D through storytelling. And the eBase Africa, where we work, is also leading the evidence space across French-speaking Africa. And we are integrating our work into the result from the pool international. And eBase has also played a critical role in the translation of roles within Cochrane and JBI. So I'm bringing in the eBase experience of storytelling transfer model, and what we have done with graphics in global south. So that is where I come with my own experience in eBase. Thank you, and over.
Great. Thank you very, very much. It sounded like you were in a very busy space. Because I know a lot about eBase, I could make out most of what you were saying. So thank you for sharing those experiences, both on the tech side and then making the evidence come alive through storytelling, really powerful examples. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask Carla to come in. We asked Carla, as now CEO of Cochrane, to speak a little bit about where we are with sharing and reusing synthesis data to foreshadow the conversation that we're going to come to around a new business model. So Zhao, your question about sustainability, that's very much tied up in, can we collectively work to a business model that will work for all of the key players in the space? So that's going to be a focus of some of the upcoming calls. But Carla, could I turn it over to you, please?
Can you hear me?
I can. Yep.
Great, fantastic. So I want to start by saying that, I've been on this space for 30 years, and I started as a young researcher from Brazil, going to England and trying to get everything I could do to go back to my country. I didn't manage to stay, but it's fantastic what we are seeing, and I think we should all celebrate that. There is a lot of challenge for us. There's a lot of things going on that needs to get right, but we have never seen this walking the talk and saying, okay, we need to really have a much balanced and co-production and equity and leadership from the South, all these things that will help us make collective impact. So that's my personal view. What I'm speaking, it's just very much on behalf of, we gather information from the Cochrane collaboration, Campbell collaboration, and JBI, just to give you a sense of the things we have been doing. Many of these things are in partnership with many of you. We work very closely to James and his team, etc. We are part of Destiny, we're part of Galenus. I see that some of my colleagues from Galenus are in the call as well. And a lot of this is being currently funded by the Wellcome Trust, but also ESIC, KRI in our area, and other funders. So grateful and thank you for that. So in Cochrane, we've been looking at data for quite some time because we are not really a very usual journal. We are very much a database repository. We have all the challenges of our database repository. So in April, 2.5 years ago, we changed the way that people enter the data to have more structured package. Many of you have probably used RevMan, our software, but just to say that the data in RevMan is actually owned by the authors, and the author has to allow us to create the synthesis and reuse. But we do have ways of reusing the data so far, although this is done together with our publisher Wiley, and we'll talk a little bit about the challenge for that. And we have been looking at a number of initiatives to facilitate data sharing and reuse. Our colleagues on Campbell are much faster than us because also they have potentially a smaller database, but they've been since 2021. They've changed their policies to make sure that that the authors are expected to share their data, and they've seen compliance with this policy increasing exponentially on the past 2-3 years. And for JBI, they do not have a formal policy, but authors can share the data, and they have a hybrid model where members have full access to their data in the database. External users need a subscription. How we share the data in Cochrane. So we share search strategy, citation, study data, risk of bias, and synthesis analysis. We share it either with generic tools or, as I mentioned, specialized tools, mostly RevMan for the data and Grade Pro for the summary of findings. And we allowed the authors to reuse the data, but we also, upon request, offer the data to people that request and explain why and how they're going to use this data. We have a study-centric model to collect the data, what improved the ability for reusability. And we also, all our data are PICO annotated, what means that machine learning and metadata is easier to define. Campbell has shared their data through supplementary material, and it covers search strategy, citations, extracted data, and analytic code. And they're seeing an increasing uptake of open repository practice. JBI, the data is embedded on published reviews and appendix. They have on the appendix full search strategy and study characteristics, detailed study characteristics, and they add large data sets as supplementary files. But the data is stored on their own repository and is accessible only to their reviewers, to the review teams, not third-party access. So I'm not going to talk about business model because this is the feature, but we have been discussing quite a lot of how, these changes need to increase, to improve our business model and needs to take into account, sustainability. Someone asked this question. It's a big challenge for an organization like Cochrane and for these three organizations, and I'm assuming for much others. But just to summarize, I think Campbell has been able to move much faster than JBI and Cochrane. And the progress that they've made is very much aligned with the ESIC roadmap. JBI they publish what we want. They publish a number of types of reviews and different methods, so this makes it more complicated. And they don't have support so far for open data transition, but they're looking at ways that internal and external support can emerge from these discussions. In Cochrane, as I said, we have a lot of building blocks, technical specification, multiple platforms, and we have a very large database, but we have barriers. The main barrier is that a lot of our data, it's hard to maintain the data up to date. The complexities of ownership, these are all about policies and are things that we're looking at review. But most important is how we work in terms of copyright, in terms of for the authors and also with the publisher. And for all of these, I think what's important for all of us to take into account is that we really need a long-term sustainability to be able to shift this information. We have a lot of interest in the organization to completely shift the model. We are looking at ways that will test what this shift means, but we need all of us collectively to think about sustainability to be able to guarantee that whatever shift, it's a public good that will help everyone. So I'm going to stop here, John. I'm not talking about business model because this is the next step, but I'm happy to answer any question.
Amazing. Super, really helpful, Carla. And I'm thrilled by the comments in the chat box with folks coming in from other sectors, folks from CABI, CGIAR. There's a number of people on the line from the education sector. So keep in mind for my health colleagues that health is absolutely part of this, but this is meant to really cover all sectors. And one of the things I'm taking away is huge amounts of incredibly exciting work in this open data system space. It's very uneven across sectors. It's not joined up across silos. Ariana and colleagues convened a meeting of the multilateral development banks a couple of weeks ago in Washington, and they said, look, we need to ask cross-sectoral questions. So even if we ask a question that sounds health-related, like what would move the needle on under 5 mortality, we don't want to just look at the health evidence. We want to look at the agriculture evidence and many, many other sectors. What I see a lot of in the chat box, and Carla's comment spoke to it, is the lack of a sustainable business model. So amazing work. How do we work in a more joined up collective impact approach that allows us to work really well within sectors, but also across sectors and in a way that can be sustainably supported? We just have a couple of minutes left, 3 minutes left. Are there any pressing questions for Carla? I don't see any in the chat box. And keep in mind that this is the first call of 3. It's our first effort to bring together all of the players that we know to be working in the open data system space. If you look at the Excel file attached to the calendar entry and you think there are groups that we have missed, from any sector working with any part of the data flows that we've talked about today, please do suggest them. Again, we're hoping for a maximum of 1 representative from the Global North, up to 2 from the Global South, from any organization or initiative that may be contributing currently to this space and that we all may benefit from having at the table as we talk about next steps. So we will send out, I don't see any other questions, we will send out a link to the recording from today, the presentations that were provided, as well as some minutes. We have another call that will happen in early November, and then in this first series of 3, a final call later in November. And I'll just turn it over to Tarek again, who is the focal point for all things ESIC. Welcome for some final comments. So Tarek, over to you.
Thanks very much, John. And not a huge amount to add to what you've already said. It's clear that there's a huge amount of work already underway in this space and lots of momentum for us to build on. So I think that we've done a good job in this call in terms of laying out where we are. And I'm also hearing like a lot of capability and willingness from everyone to kind of contribute and coordinate in the right way here. Just one reflection, I think when we think about when you think about technology or a data platform, often, one big database sort of comes to mind. We know in reality, it's not necessarily going to be like that. There are obviously multiple components and multiple elements of the system that may knit together into something that is abstractly one whole, but the system itself it's fine to have some complexity. And I think we're going to have to get our hands dirty and understand what the nuance and complexity is. So I'll leave that as my sort of final thought. Thanks again to everyone for making the time to join us today, and we look forward to seeing you in early November. Is that it, John, or anything else from you? In which case, I'll close the call. Thanks again, and see you next time. Cheerio.